Thank you, Janet and Sandy. This past Wednesday morning, I had gotten up. Day was starting off very normal. I had gotten into the shower and gotten out of the shower. I needed to iron a shirt and a pair of pants. I'd done that. I'd gone into the kitchen to begin fixing my lunch. Caroline was in the process of getting the kids some breakfast. And as she's doing that, the kids are in the den just watching TV. Caroline, she's busy doing that, and I go towards the refrigerator to get something, and Caroline says, I meant to mention earlier, when I opened the refrigerator door this morning, I found something. She said, I found a Minnie Mouse doll, I found a child's loom, and I also found a Curious George book. And you know what? I didn't even flinch. I didn't say, what? Who? I didn't have to ask the question, what? I didn't have to ask the question, who? Because I knew that could be answered with one word, Catherine. Catherine. And when you have a 2-year-old in your house, rare is the occasion that you're surprised by anything. Now, when you have a 2-year-old in your house, by virtue of that fact, you just expect some things to be different. Hang that thought in your mind for just a second. By virtue of a fact, you expect some things to be different. Now, we've been working our way through 1 Peter, and among the things that Peter has communicated is that as followers of Christ, our ultimate allegiance and our citizenship resides with Christ. Now, if that is true, and it is true if you're a follower of Christ, then there are going to be, understandably, some different things about you. Some things about your life that are markedly different from those that are outside a relationship with Christ. And that's going to be true not simply of you and your life, it's also going to be true of you and your relationships. And let me just put it in very plain, simple terms. If you are a follower of Christ and your allegiance and your citizenship ultimately resides with Him, then if you are married or you aspire to be married, then your marriage as a follower of Christ ought to be different, markedly different than those that are outside of Christ. Well, the question is, in what way? And the picture that Peter paints very simply is this. It should be a relationship, a marriage that is characterized by honor. But honor in what way? He answers that in 1 Peter chapter 3. If you would look with me today in 1 Peter chapter 3, starting with verse 1. 1 Peter chapter 3, starting with verse 1. First Peter chapter 3, verse 1, Peter says, "Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands." Thank you for being here today. Would you bow your heads? No, just... Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. For in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are if you do good and are not afraid with any terror. Husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. All right, so Peter in this passage is painting a picture of what the marriage, the relationship between a husband and wife ought to look like when you're a follower of Christ, when your allegiance and your citizenship resides, with Him. And again, as I said a moment ago, it becomes and should be a relationship that is characterized by honor. And the first honor that Peter speaks of is this: a disposition God honors. A disposition God honors. Let me start out of the gate with a few recognitions. First of all, I recognize we have looked at 7 verses this morning. 6 of them specifically address wives. 1 verse addresses husbands. Where is the problem? I'm just messing with you. It's clear that he's saying more here to wives than to husbands. And so you may recoil against that, but I recognize, as hopefully you recognize, that this is not the only passage that speaks to God's expectations of what the home and specifically what the marriage is to look like. And so don't be taken aghast by that. The second recognition I would like to have you consider is this. I am keenly aware of the fact that in the year 2014, here in American society and culture, what we just read is considered anything other than being politically correct. Can we agree on that? This is not viewed to be politically correct. Here's the final recognition. God has never been, is not, and never is going to be concerned with political correctness. So can we just start with that premise? Now, I recognize that a lot of folks today can look at a passage such as this and say, well, that's kind of understandable. Peter is writing in the 1st century A.D. That's a long time ago. Furthermore, it's a very patriarchal society, and so this is the fruit of that type of culture and that type of society. And so what he says has limited cultural context. To that, I would say very simply, that is wrong. That what you see here is not an expectation that is culturally bound, is not time restricted. Rather, this is and has consistently throughout the course of Scripture been the plan, the purpose, and the express description that God has of what the marriage and what the family is to look like. Furthermore, I would say to you this, if we understand and do our homework and digging into what God through Peter here says, I believe that a couple of things become true. First of all, this becomes far more acceptable and more palatable to us. Then we're like, oh yeah, I get that. And beyond that, it makes it far more desirable where you would say, as a wife or as a husband, that's what I want my marriage to look like. That being said, let's dig into what he says. He starts in verse 1 with this admonition. He says, wives, be submissive to your own husbands. Now, this word and this concept of submission, I want you to understand, is the expression of voluntary submission. It is not to be coerced. It is not to be forced or enforced. Rather, it is the expectation, the request is made, will you voluntarily submit to your husband? It's the same type of submission that we talked about last week back in chapter 2, where Peter says to subject yourselves to every ordinance of man. He's talking about willingly making the decision and choice, I'm going to subject myself to those that are in civil or governmental authority. It's the same picture, it's the same concept you see here, but in this case, it's not with government, it's in the home. And he says, wives, be submissive to your own husbands. This is a call again to voluntary submission, which is to say this. You can decide, I'm not going to do that. You can decide, I don't want to do that, and therefore will consequently not do that. You're free to do so. Understand, this is what God is asking you to do. This is what God is expecting you to do, to make the decision and make the choice that I am going to intentionally and willingly submit myself to my husband. Now, this whole idea of submission, again, is one very much that 21st century American society recoils against. And that offense that is taken to a notion such as this, I believe, is very much founded on a notion that, though logical, is completely wrong. And here's the notion. If a man and a woman are doing different things, one is superior and one is inferior. If we're not doing the same thing, one is more important than the other. Let me ask you this. If Caroline is folding clothes and I'm cutting grass, which is more important? Well, they both need to be done. They're different. There's no difference in value, but there is difference in function. That's the premise that we need to be operating on. That in God's eyes, first of all, as people, there's no shades of value where God views me or God views you as more valuable than the person next to you. There's absolute equality in God's eyes in our worth and value. And specifically within the home, within the marriage, God views the husband and the wife as both being absolutely and equally valuable and equally essential in the home. So there's absolute equality in that. What there is, according to God's plan, is a divergence of and a difference in function and role. And a difference in function and role does not equate to one being superior and another being inferior. A good case in point is within the Trinity itself. Let me give you an example. Jesus said this in John chapter 10. I and the Father are one. That's an unmistakable, unequivocal claim by Jesus to being full deity. Jesus was saying, I am God. But then Jesus says 4 chapters later in John chapter 14, the Father is greater than I. And doesn't that sound like a contradiction? How can both of those things be true? Well, both of those things can be true, and that tension can be resolved when you understand the nature of the Trinity itself. That we believe, and the Scriptures communicate, that there is one God that has revealed Himself as being eternally distinct in Father, Son, and Spirit. And within the members of the Godhead, among Father, Son, and Spirit, there's absolute equality in nature. The Father is God. The Son is God. The Spirit is God. Though there is absolute equality in nature, there is divergence in function, and there is subjection in office. There are things that the Father does that the Son doesn't do. Things that the Spirit does that neither the Father or the Son does. For example, it was Jesus who took on human flesh and came into this world and did so subjecting Himself to the plan of the Father. And it was Jesus who died on the cross, not the Son and not the Spirit. Now, Paul says in 1 Corinthians that it is the Spirit that gives gifts to the church, not the Father, not the Spirit. In Galatians chapter 5, Paul says of the Spirit that He is the one that grants to individual believers these what are described as fruits of the Spirit. Again, that's a function and purpose of the Spirit, not of the Son and not of the Father. So there is absolute equality in nature and value, but there's difference in role and function. And that doesn't make the Spirit better than the Son or the Father better than the Son. There's absolute equality in nature, but difference in role and function. And it's that type of mentality that God wants us to have as we come to the family. That between a husband and a wife, neither of you, not a one of you, is more valuable or more important in God's eyes or anybody else's than the other. But there is a difference in function and purpose. And though it is not at all viewed to be politically correct, God has established that the husband operate as the leader within the home. Now, this does not mean that the wife is somehow a passive bystander where she has no buy-in, no say-so, no communication whatsoever in terms of the decisions and the choices of the family. That she just go, okay. That's not whatsoever, I believe, as to how this is supposed to look like. It does, however, mean this, that God is going to hold somebody in your family accountable for the direction of your family. Somebody is going to be held to account. And God's not leaving it up for surprise sake as to who is going to be held to account. He's told us who it is, and it's going to be the husband. Guys, hear me in this. You will stand before the Lord one day to give an account, not simply for what you did in this life in terms of how you served Him. You will give to account before the Lord not simply what type of follower of Christ you were and the type of life that you lived. You're going to give an account for what type of husband you were and the direction of your family. That's going to rest with you. He doesn't say that's a charge that He's going to hold to account for the wife. He says that this is going to be towards the husband because He's identified, according to His plan and purpose, guys, this is a role and function that I'm putting at your lap. And I'm going to hold you to account. And operating as the leader within the home means, among other things, that you safeguard the relationships within your home, within your family, with each other. Beyond that, it means that you seek to safeguard your family from threats, external threats, whether those be physical or spiritual. Furthermore, that you seek to safeguard your family from internal threats, whether they be physical or emotional or spiritual. And beyond that, there's the additional expectation that Paul communicates that you put your good behind that of your wife. That you love her and sacrificially do anything for her ultimate good, as Paul says, loving her as Christ loved the church and gave Himself for her. That prevents this leadership from becoming dictatorial, from becoming some immeasurable tyrannical rule. Yeah, there's a function of leadership, and it's ultimately an expression of accountability that God's going to hold you as a husband accountable for the direction of your home and your family. And what God asks of you, ladies, as a wife, will you make the decision and the choice to grant your husband the freedom to fulfill his role while you fulfill yours? It's not that yours is less. It's not that his is more. It's just that the role is different. But in expressing all of this, Peter goes on to say, with a caution in verse 3, he says, "Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel." Understand this. Both for men and women, there's a biblical mandate for modesty, that we are to present ourselves modestly. And what Peter is saying here, do not misinterpret it as being a prohibition against wearing nice things. It's not a prohibition against fixing your hair or having a necklace on or having jewelry on or possessing those things. It's not a prohibition against that whatsoever. Rather it is, in addition, not saying that you should just care less how you look and that your hair ought to look like last year's bird nest and that you ought to just come in with dirty, stinky, wrinkled clothes all the time. He's not saying don't put your best foot forward and try to present yourself in the best light possible. He's not saying that at all. He is saying don't put all your eggs in that basket. Don't be focused on the external at the expense of the internal. Rather, he says, let it be the hidden person of the heart, who you are on the inside. Because it's there you're able to experience incorruptible beauty. Incorruptible beauty. A couple weeks ago, Caroline and I were out and we saw this girl. She was probably in her early 20s and she had, I guess technically it was a dress. It was so short and so tight though. It was just ridiculous. And but there were no surprises about her body because of this dress that she had on. And Caroline and I both note this, and she says, I hope she enjoys that now. You let her have a couple of kids and try to cram into that thing and see what happens. You're aware that with the passage of time, time doesn't help our bodies. It doesn't do our bodies any favors. Wrinkles begin to set in, hair changes color or it changes location, right? That physically our bodies grow weaker and the effects of aging, they just happen. And beauty, you understand, it fades. But Peter is saying, listen, you can experience beauty that doesn't require Botox. You can experience beauty that doesn't have to get extensions. You can experience beauty that doesn't have to go get the roots dyed. Incorruptible beauty on the inside that's characterized with a gentle and quiet spirit. This is absolute beauty and elegance with who you are as a woman on the inside. And about this, notice what Peter says. This is not merely precious. Rather, he says it's very precious in the sight of God. Very precious in the sight of God. April the 11th of 2004 was an Easter Sunday. I was pastoring back then, obviously, in Charlotte, and Caroline and I had been dating. After the service was over, everybody else had left. I'd gotten her back into the sanctuary, and in front of the first pew, I got down on one knee, and I pulled out this little black ring box, and I opened it as it contained a ring, and I asked her to be, the luckiest woman in the course of human history. But the ring that was inside, I did not go to my closet and pull out a coat hanger and get some wire snips and cut off a piece of metal and with a pair of pliers shape it into a circle. And then go out to the driveway and see if I could find some rocks that didn't have a whole lot of dirt on them and hot glue them to that circle and give this to her and present it to her as an engagement ring. Now, I went to the jewelry store and bought a ring that was made of gold and had diamonds in it. Consequently, I paid a lot more for it than a coat hanger and some rocks from the driveway. A lot more for it. The question, though, is why are diamonds and why is gold so expensive? Now, you could argue, and there is absolute truth in the sense that because those things are viewed as being desirable or beautiful by people, there's a demand. Where there's a demand, price goes up. That's true. But there's other things that people think are beautiful. Other stones, for example, that people think are attractive that don't cost as much as diamonds. I mean, people are spending a lot of money on granite countertops these days, aren't they? They're pretty. How many people have you known putting diamond countertops in? Why are we not doing that? Because it's so much more expensive. Well, why is it so much more expensive? Why is it considered a precious jewel and gold a precious metal? Not simply because of its attractiveness or desirability, but ultimately because of its rarity. You don't go out in the yard and plow up your backyard to plant a garden in the spring and, oh, there's another hunk of gold. Oh, look at that big old diamond. Let me see if Caroline wants that. You don't do that. We don't find these things everywhere. They are so rare. Not only are they viewed as being attractive and desirable by us, but they are viewed as precious metals or precious stone because of their rarity. Ladies, understand this. God views it as being a precious thing, a beautiful sight, an entirely attractive thing. For a woman to make the decision and choice, I'm going to grant my husband the freedom to fulfill his role. And yes, I'm going to present myself as best I can physically, but where I'm putting most of my eggs is the woman that I am on the inside. God views that as a beautiful thing, but furthermore, He views it as precious because, unfortunately, it's altogether rare. Listen, we as followers of Christ ought to have marriages that are just different. And Peter is saying that wives, within the context of a Christian marriage, a marriage that's seeking to follow Christ, they can and should have a disposition that God honors. That He looks at and says, that's a beautiful thing, and seeks to honor and bless that and bring honor and blessing into your life. But there's another honor that Peter speaks about that we should pursue, and that's an example that men honor. An example that men honor. You see this actually going on in two places in the text. The first is in verse 1, where he says, even if some do not obey the word, they may without a word be won by the conduct of their wives. Peter is trying to speak of the hypothetical situation where you have a woman that loves God and follows Christ, and she is married to a man that is either not a follower of Christ or one who is, that has become wayward and has wandered and drifted from the Lord. And he speaks of how she can influence her husband. And the influence that he speaks of is not berating, is not wagging the finger, it's not nagging, it's not fighting with. Rather, he says, without a word, they may be won, which is to say that they can be brought back to Christ or brought to Christ by the conduct of their wives. The picture that he is painting is that of a woman whose Christ-like example and consistent Christ-likeness is more unanswerable than the finest honed argument or the most sensible logic. That the husband then looks at his wife and sees, man, day in and day out, year in and year out. I mean, she's not only going to church and hearing this and talking about this, man, this woman so believes that it's affecting every aspect of her lives. And Peter's suggesting that the hope is in time, he begins to follow what his wife does and comes to the Lord, not because of arguments, not because of logic, not because of emotional appeals, but rather through a gentle and quiet spirit and the consistency of her character, the consistency of her conduct. It becomes an example that men honor by following. But he communicates it in another way. In verse 5, he says, in this manner, in former times, which is to say, back in the day, there were holy, which is to say set apart women like this. I mean, their lives were different, and as wives they were different than many of the others in society because they trusted God. And he says they adorned themselves in this way. They sought to pursue this gentle and quiet spirit, that they sought to pursue internal beauty and made the choice and decision to yield to their husband's leadership, to grant him the freedom to be the leader within the home. And he says, and he cites an example in verse 6. He says, as Sarah obeyed Abraham. The word translated as obeyed there means to hear under. It's a continuation of this idea of subjection. So Sarah was the wife of Abraham, and then it says she called him Lord. Guys, don't pay any attention to that, okay? This is not an encouragement for you to go home and mandate that your wife say to you, yes, master, anytime you beckon or call. But there are biblical instances where she referenced him as being Lord. He's saying Sarah operated this way. But notice how he says at the end of verse 6, whose daughters you are if you do this. Now, what he's saying is, you can be like a Sarah. Now, Abraham was her husband, the one that we recognize as being this one that God used to become the father of a great nation. I mean, Sarah was the mother of a great nation. I mean, one of the most revered and respected women, not simply in the Old Testament, but in all the Bible. That people for thousands of years until the writing of 1 Peter were honoring this woman and speaking of her in praiseworthy ways and talking about the woman that she was, talking of her, of the wife that she was. This is somebody that we ought to look to. And Peter is saying, and even as he's seeking to honor her, man, you can be in that type of company. Not with just anybody, but with Sarah, this great saint from the Old Testament. You can be an example that not simply your husband honors, but even those that follow you in generations to come will honor. One of the most unpleasant tasks that I've had with Caroline in parenting has been this whole process of naming our children. I don't know why, but I always hated having those conversations because the truth is it's a big deal when you name a child because, barring court action, they're going to be stuck with that for the rest of their lives. And so you want to make sure you kind of get it right. Now, as much as I didn't like those conversations, Caroline loved those conversations, loved to just talk about baby names. In fact, to this day, even last night, she was talking about baby names. If she has an idle moment and her mind can just go elsewhere, she's going to think of little boy names and little girl names. And you know the only baby name I'm interested in? It's a Spanish name. El Finito. Well, that was great, wasn't it? Anyway, so we went through all that with our 4 kids, and Caroline loved having those conversations. When we'd have those conversations, ours, I'm sure, were like yours and others of parents who were expecting and trying to come up with a little boy or little girl's name. And as we would float different possibilities, we would do so through the lens of people that we have known who have had that name before. So I may, for example, mention a name, and Caroline would say, oh, no, I used to go to school with one. No, I couldn't stand him. No, that's a bad one. Or Caroline may float a name, and I say, oh, no, I used to know somebody with that name. She was a bat. No, let's pass on that name. And then we would go through the Bible, and we'd go through a list of Bible names and trying to come up with names that we could agree on. One night, though, when we were talking about some names, I made this not profound statement, but simple statement. I said, it's interesting. Nobody has ever named their little girl Jezebel. Have you ever known anybody, apart from the biblical character Jezebel, to name their little girl, oh, so cute, let's name her Jezebel? Have you known anybody that's named their child that? No, odds are you have not. Why? Well, who was Jezebel? She was this awful, despicable, loathsome, tyrannical despot of a woman. An absolute godless, mean, horrific woman. And nobody wants to name their child that because they don't want to suggest her to be an example that their little girl would ever follow. By contrast, how many Sarahs have you known? How many thousands of years have passed since God gave her that name? that men and women have been naming their little girl Sarah. Why? Because among other things, she was such a wonderful example. And what does Peter say? Whose daughters you are. He's saying you can be in the company of somebody like that, somebody that generations, millennia have been naming their children after. You can be in that type of company where you are a woman that not simply your husband honors, but that others honor. Christian marriages ought to be those that are replete with honor. There ought to be a disposition that God honors. There ought to be an example that men honor. But finally, he speaks of an expression that men honor. Well, you may be thinking, well, finally, something for the guys. And we get to it now in verse 7, where he says specifically to husbands, he says, likewise, dwell with them, which is to say, live with your wives with understanding. The word that's used there that's translated as understanding is the Greek word gnosis. It means knowledge. Dwell with your wife in knowledge. Now, some could, and this is a perfectly reasonable interpretation and perfectly reasonable application of this thought, of what he says. They've taken this verse to say, hey guys, what you need to do is to really know your wife as a person. Really know your wife as a woman and what it is that she likes and she dislikes, what pleases her, what sets her off, what encourages her, what helps her. Know all of those things and pursue that knowledge and act accordingly. So live with your wife in that type of knowledge. And I think that's good and prudent advice. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is one actually that I prefer. And I believe that the knowledge that he is speaking of is not necessarily knowledge of your wife, though that is prudent and altogether necessary. I believe that the knowledge that he's speaking of is of God and His will for you and for your family. Husbands, I want you to live with your wives understanding what it is that God expects of you and what He expects of your family. You know, to be honest with you, so many of us, what we're just doing is just doing. We're just getting by. We're not thinking about any of those things. But I really believe the expectation that God has on us, guys, on us as husbands, you better know what the standards of God are. You better know and come to understand what it is that God wants and desires and expects your family to be and operate and what it's to look like, and then pursue that. He says, dwell with them. And then he says, giving honor to the wife. The word that's used there that's translated honor is a Greek word that was generally used to convey something that was viewed as a treasure, something of great value. He says, guys, that's how you ought to be dealing with your husband. Guys, that's how you ought to be dealing with your wives. That you honor them, that you view them and treat them as though they're a treasure. I mean, they are God's gift to you, and treat them accordingly. That you honor them with courtesy and grace and civility and respect. That you just don't say whatever you want, however you want. That you view them, that they're God's gift to you, and you treat them graciously. You show them consistent courtesy, grace, and respect. That you express to them your love both in what you do, but also in your words. That every manner in which you deal with your wife ought to be characterized as being an honor to her, putting her in a place of honor in your heart and in your mind. And then he says, do so as to the weaker vessel. Now you read that and you think, oh, there goes Peter again. Chauvinism at its finest. In what way is it that women are weaker? Well, understand, there's nothing in the New Testament that communicates whatsoever that women are intellectually inferior to men. There's some dumb women, there's some smart ones. There's a lot more dumb men, I think, than smart ones. But you know what? We're all in the same boat intellectually. Beyond that, the New Testament doesn't whatsoever make a distinction as men being or women being morally or spiritually superior to the other. There's absolute equality in that. So in what way is it that women can be weaker? I think the only option that we're left with is physical. That generally, and I believe Peter's speaking in general terms, that generally men are physically stronger than women. Now, I recognize that there are exceptions to that. I guess it was about, 6 or 8 weeks ago. Somebody came to the office one day, and they came through this side door over here. When they came in, they said, "You've got a possum over there underneath the bush outside the office door." No, that ought not be. And I go out, sure enough, there's a possum huddled up underneath there, awake. Possums should not be awake in the daytime. They should be awake only at nighttime, getting ready to lay down out in the middle of the road, right? Anyway, I see this possum, and I believe him to be injured. I don't know if he got hit by a car in a fight with another animal, but he's awake, and he looks like that he's injured. And really, I felt sorry for him. I felt sorry for him for a couple of reasons. First of all, he's nasty. And I felt bad for him because he can't help that. That's how God made him, right? Possums are just nasty. God made them nasty, and I feel sorry that God just happened to choose to make him a nasty little possum. And then I feel sorry for him because he's sitting there and he's injured. And I'm not going to be taking him to the vet and say, "Here, can you do something to help him?" But beyond that, I recognize an injured animal can be very dangerous. And so they're hurt, and they may view others, maybe those coming to the church, as a threat and may respond accordingly. So I know we need to get this thing out of here. And so I went in and asked Nancy if she would call animal control, tell them about it, and see if they would come out. Within probably 10 to 15 minutes, a Guilford County animal control van pulls up, and this lady gets out, and she's not very talkative. She gets out of the van, and she just asks where the possum is. And I pointed, I said, "He's over there." And so really, without saying much of anything, she pulls a collapsible baton from her belt, the type that police use. And so she whacks that baton out, so it's about this long. And so she goes over. She doesn't grab a glove. She doesn't do anything. She walks over with that baton, and she pushes that bush back just so that she can see the possum. She reaches in with her bare hand and grabs that possum by the tail. She pulls him up, and that possum's like, with his little nasty teeth. And she's holding on to that nasty tail with her bare hands, and that possum's like this, and she just walks over and she takes him back to the van. She puts him into that cage. She shuts the door and she said, "Y'all got anything else?" And I said, "No, ma'am, but thank you." I said, "You're a better man than I." Now, when Peter speaks of women here being the weaker vessel, I understand that sometimes there are some exceptions to that. Well, generally speaking, though, we have to recognize, by virtue of God's design in nature, generally men have greater physical strength than women. And men, he says, ought to act accordingly. Let me just be very plain in saying this. I very much recoil and am very much incensed at what is going on in American society and culture with the blurring of gender roles. I'm very much disturbed with the blurring of gender identities. Are you aware in California now, if you can be a man, but just say, I'm kind of like a woman. You can go in the ladies' bathroom in California now? According to the courts. I don't get that. This, I believe to be absolutely true, that God has made men and He has made women different. He's made us different. Not better and worse. He's just made us different. And different is okay. And different is good. And we ought to celebrate those differences. We ought to take delight in the fact that God has chosen to do this. Not to say that one is better than the other, but we're just different. Now, I recognize that the National Organization of Women may very much take odds at what I'm getting ready to say, but I still believe I'm right and they're wrong in this. Women today, even in 2014 America, want men to act like men. I really believe that women are still looking today for men to just act like men. Furthermore, I believe that they are looking not simply for men to act like men, and it's not that they're looking for men to treat them like women. They're looking for men to treat them like ladies. And that's very different. But it is that exact difference, I believe, that Peter is calling on us as husbands. That's part of your role. That's part of your function. That's part of your God-given expectation. And I believe he is saying, if you do this, that is an expression that your wife will absolutely, positively respond to. That she will respond to your expressions of honor with honor that comes back to you. This is not simply, I believe, good and prudent counsel. I believe it's consequential counsel. Peter says, guys, that you're to operate in this way. And notice how he says it. That your prayers may not be hindered. The word hindered literally means to strike or to cut off. The point is this: a husband faces the interruption of his own prayer life, the interruption of his own devotional walk with God if he does not treat. Guys, if you are not treating and responding to your wife in this manner, let me put it very simply. If this does not characterize how you treat and how you operate and how you live with your wife, things between you and God, they're not okay. And he doesn't say this to the wife, he says this to the husband. Guys, if you're the one that's going to be held to account for this. And if this is not how you behave, if this is not how you operate, things between you and the God of the universe, they are not okay. Your prayer life, well, you're wasting your time until you get things right into your home. Things between you and your Lord, they are not right. But I want to tie all this together with a beautiful word picture that Peter gives there in verse 7, where he says, heirs together of the grace of life. Heirs together of the grace of life. This communicates that marriage, among other things, it's a team sport. It's a team sport. We each have our different roles and functions on the team, but we're both equal and essential members of the team. We just got different God-given roles and functions that He wants us to fulfill. But when the husband is doing his part, when the wife is doing her part, well, the blessings that come your way because you're experiencing God's plan and purpose for your home, best described as being heirs together of the grace of life. In the Old Testament, Israel was described as the wife of Jehovah. In the New Testament, the church is portrayed as being the bride of Christ. In the New Testament, followers of Christ are described as being children of God through the process of adoption. Even the experience of salvation is cast in a family mold where it's described as being a new birth. What I want to be very plain about is this: God takes this family thing very, very seriously. And if you're serious about following Him, and if, as Peter describes, your allegiance and your citizenship ultimately resides with Him, not only are you going to be different, man, your relationship with your spouse, with your wife, with your husband, it's going to be markedly different. Different than those that are outside of Christ. Very simply, I leave you with this question: is that true of your marriage? Won't you bow your heads with me? You know, there's not a person in here that has or is going to experience a perfect marriage, because marriages consist of husbands and wives that are anything less than perfect. But God has a plan and a purpose for imperfect people that He brings together in marriage, where you're both absolutely equal and worth and value, but you've got different functions and purposes. Ladies, those of you who are here today who are married or aspire to be married, which basket are you putting all your eggs in? Is it that you look good, but you're not good? This whole idea of pursuing inner beauty, incorruptible beauty, becoming a woman of a gentle spirit that loves God and trusts Him with all of her heart, is that a portrait of you? If not, the question is, do you want it to be? In just a moment, we're going to have a time of decision where you can, where you are, maybe come to kneel at this altar and say, God, I want my part in this marriage to look like that. Guys, you're here this morning, and whether you're married or you aspire to be married, is this the manner in which you want to be treating your wife? Is this the manner in which you are dealing with your wife? With one that is replete with honor and courtesy and grace? Will your behavior and your words towards her represent sacrifice, not indifference? Well, if not, is it going to stay that way? You've got a chance this morning to make a decision, a choice for things to be different. Maybe it is that you're here today as a husband, but in particular, maybe here as a wife, and your husband is described in verse 1 as one that either is not a follower of Christ, and if that's not the case, maybe he is one but has wandered and drifted from Him. And maybe you just want to pray that God gives you the ability to experience what Peter describes, that he might be one, that he might be able to be brought back to the Lord, that he might become this type of husband and this type of man before you and before God. Maybe there's some other burden that's on your heart, or maybe it is that we've been singing this morning so much about the blood of Jesus and having this relationship with Him, and you'd say, I don't know that I have that, but I'd like to find out how to experience that. Maybe it is to become a part of this church family. The simple truth is that God speaks. He speaks through His Spirit and He speaks through His Word. As you have heard Him speak today, the question is now, what will you do? Lord, thank You for giving us the ability to experience love and grace and unity and forgiveness and strength and encouragement and correction, and no better way than within the confines of marriage. This whole marriage thing was not the state's idea, it was your idea. This was your plan. And the one that created it, You gave us a picture of what it's to look like. Lord, every one of us that is married today can say there's room for growth and room for improvement. And specific ways that You're speaking to us today, I pray that we will respond, whether that's about our marriage and role in it, whether it's about our walk with You, and maybe even our relationship with this church. If You have spoken today, help us to respond with faith and obedience. We ask this of You in Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to ask if you would to stand as Tom and our praise team lead us in the hymn of invitation. As God's spoken to you, you respond today.
Sweetly, Lord, have we heard Thee calling, come follow me. And we see where Thy footprints falling lead us to Thee. Footprints of Jesus that make the pathway glow. We will follow the steps of Jesus where they go. Though they lead o'er the cold, dark mountains, seeking His sheep, or along by Siloam's fountains, helping the weak. Footprints of Jesus that make the pathway glow. We will follow the steps of Jesus where they go.
Thank you for being here this morning, and my encouragement is if you look around, there's a lot of folks that you have hopefully noticed today that aren't here. And if you get a chance, send that card or make that phone call and let them know that they were missed, so that hopefully we can get some of this vacation stuff out of our system and all be back together again. Let me just remind you that Nancy is our church secretary is on vacation this week. If you were to call and to get her voicemail, she's not going to obviously be responding this week. So if you would either get myself or Shep or Judy or Dan, and we will try to help you as best we can. But it's good to see you this morning. And Robert, you got all right. I'm going to ask Robert Rue if he would come and dismiss us in prayer. Again, if you're a guest, I'd love to meet you. I'll be at the doors at the back of the sanctuary. Robert.
Shall we pray? Lord, we want to thank you